The horrific final days of Queen Anne of Great Britain. Section 1, August 1, 1714. A paralyzed queen lies dying in Kensington Palace, unable to speak, unable to move, and yet her physicians record something impossible. Queen Anne of Great Britain has just consumed an enormous quantity of black heart cherries. How does a woman who hasn't spoken in 2 days, whose limbs won't obey her commands, somehow eat what doctors called an inordinate amount of fruit while her body shuts down organ by organ? This wasn't just the death of a monarch. This was the culmination of a life so brutal, so filled with unimaginable loss, that even her final hours would become a battleground where politicians literally grabbed her dying hand to force one last signature, and physicians wielded hot irons like instruments of torture. Queen Anne was 49 years old when she died, but her body had the wear of someone twice that age. By July 1714, she wasn't simply ill. She was a collection of failing systems barely held together by willpower alone. Her feet had swollen so grotesquely from what doctors called dropsy that they had to be permanently wrapped in specially made bandages, changed multiple times daily by servants who burned the used wrappings because the discharge in blood made them too foul to wash. She hadn't walked in over a year. But the real horror lay deeper, in a disease no one could name. Modern physicians studying her portraits can see the evidence, a distinctive butterfly-shaped rash across her face that artists tried to soften but could not hide. Anne had systemic lupus, though the disease wouldn't be identified for another century. Her own immune system was destroying her from the inside, and every pregnancy made it worse. 17 pregnancies, let that number sink in like a stone into dark water. 12 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. 5 children were born alive. 4 died within 2 years. The last one, Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, made it to 11 years old, just long enough for Anne to believe she might have an heir, just long enough for her to plan a future. He died on July 30, 1700, 6 days after his 11th birthday. She never recovered from that loss, and in one of history's cruelest coincidences, she would suffer her fatal stroke exactly 14 years later, on the anniversary of his death. While Anne's body deteriorated, Britain was transforming into a global superpower. The War of Spanish Succession had ended with British victories that shattered French dominance across Europe. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 gave Britain Gibraltar, Newfoundland, and rights that would build an empire lasting 2 centuries. Anne had overseen all of this while unable to walk, while enduring pain that made her scream at night, while knowing that every achievement would die with her because she had no heir. But as she lay dying in July 1714, something even more terrifying was unfolding in the very palace where she drew her labored breaths. 2 separate coups were being planned, and the men plotting treason were standing in her bedchamber as she slipped toward death. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of history, to the moments where power, pain, and human fragility collide, then subscribe and join us as we uncover the stories that textbooks were too afraid to tell. Because what happened in Queen Anne's final days reveals a truth more chilling than any fiction, that even queens die broken, and that sometimes the crown is the heaviest burden of all. July 24, 1714. The Privy Council meeting that started the end. Anne, weighing close to 300 pounds, is wheeled into the council chamber by servants. Her face is crimson and mottled, the lupus rash combined with burst blood vessels creating a mask of suffering. She can barely hold her head up. The meeting was supposed to be routine. Instead, it exploded. The 2 most powerful men in government, Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford, and Viscount Bolingbroke, started screaming at each other. Not polite political disagreement, but actual shouting, accusations of treason and embezzlement flying across the table while other council members sat frozen. And then Anne, watching this chaos unfold, suddenly collapsed forward onto the table. Not a gentle faint, but a violent, convulsive collapse that sent papers flying and had servants rushing to catch her before she hit the floor. They carried her to her chambers, and she never truly recovered. But the real horror was only beginning, because in 72 hours, physicians would turn her final days into a torture chamber that would make medieval dungeons seem merciful. July 30, 1714, 7 o'clock in the morning. Anne woke on the anniversary of her son's death, and perhaps some part of her knew what was coming. The stroke hit during morning prayers, not a gentle fading but a violent, convulsive attack that left her thrashing on the chapel floor. Blood poured from her nose, her eyes rolled back, and her ladies-in-waiting screamed for the physicians who came running with their instruments of horror. What those doctors did to a woman who had just suffered a massive stroke goes beyond medical ignorance into the realm of systematic torture. While she was still convulsing, they opened veins in both arms, draining pint after pint of blood into ceramic bowls. The theory was that too much blood was pressuring her brain. In reality, they were dehydrating a stroke victim, reducing blood flow to her already damaged brain. Then came the cupping. Heated glass vessels pressed against her back and chest, creating vacuums that burst capillaries and left massive, painful bruises. Anne couldn't speak to tell them to stop. She could only endure. The blistering came next. They took metal instruments, heated them in the fireplace until they glowed, and deliberately burned her skin, creating open wounds on a woman whose immune system was already compromised. They shaved her head completely, every strand of hair removed so they could apply hot plasters directly to her scalp. Imagine the humiliation for a queen who had always been vain about her hair, now bald and burned, unable to protest. And through all of this, she was conscious. The stroke had taken her speech, not her awareness. She could feel everything, understand everything, but couldn't stop any of it. While Anne lay paralyzed and bleeding, the palace erupted into carefully controlled chaos. The position of Lord Treasurer was empty, and whoever held that position when Anne died would effectively control the transition of power. On July 31st, they brought Charles Talbot, Duke of Shrewsbury, to Anne's bedside. They needed her to give him the white staff of office, the symbol of authority. The official record says Anne, despite being paralyzed and speechless from her stroke, somehow managed to indicate her consent and physically hand Shrewsbury the staff. But private letters from courtiers paint a different picture, that an S hand had to be guided to the staff, her fingers arranged around it. They took a paralyzed woman's hand, physically manipulated it to hold an object, and called it royal consent. As night fell on July 31st, Anne's breathing became labored. The physicians tried one last round of treatments, more bleeding, more blistering, forcing medicines down her throat. Did they force them into her mouth in some desperate attempt at nutrition? Or was it perhaps the one thing she could still swallow? The one pleasure left to a woman who had endured 17 pregnancies, the death of every child, and now this final torture? We'll never know. But the image haunts Queen Anne, paralyzed, bald from the physicians' razors, covered in burns and bleeding wounds, somehow eating cherry after cherry in her final hours while the nation held its breath. Arbuthnot's description of that moment has become famous. I believe sleep was never more welcome to a weary traveler than death was to her. Think about those words. Her own physician, the man who had tried everything to save her, was essentially saying that death was a mercy. The moment Anne's heart stopped, the machinery of succession activated, and within minutes, messengers were galloping toward Dover with news for Hanover. But there was still the matter of Anne's body. For 3 weeks, her corpse remained at Kensington Palace because an S-body had become so swollen that standard royal coffins wouldn't work. They had to construct a special coffin, almost square in shape, massive enough to contain her remains. When the funeral finally took place, it took 14 men to carry it, for more than usual for royal funerals. They laid her next to Prince George, her husband, in Westminster Abbey. Around them in smaller coffins and urns were the remains of her 17 children, an entire potential dynasty extinct, buried in one vault. But perhaps the most revealing detail about Anne's death is unto the medical torture or the political conspiracies. It's those cherries, that inordinate quantity of black-heart cherries consumed in her final hours. Because in the end, after 17 dead children, after years of being unable to walk, after strokes that stole her voice and paralyzed her body, after physicians who burned and bled her in the name of Medicine Queen, Anne found one last small pleasure, one last taste of sweetness before the darkness. Maybe she knew she was dying and wanted one final indulgence. Maybe the cherries were forced on her by physicians trying one last remedy. Or maybe, just maybe, a servant who pitied their suffering queen brought her the only comfort they could offer: fresh fruit on a summer morning, something sweet to ease the passing. Dr. Arbuthnot was right. Death was welcome to a night's sleep to a weary traveler. After 49 years of pain, after burying everyone she loved, after being used as a political pawn even as she lay paralyzed and dying, Queen Anne finally found peace. The woman who united Great Britain died broken in body but unbroken in will, having held her kingdom together until her very last breath. Even if that breath had to be forced from her by the ambitions of the men around her. Leave a comment below. If you had been a servant in that palace, watching Queen Anne suffer through those final days, what would you have done? Would you have brought her cherries too, knowing they might be her last taste of sweetness in this world?